It seems that the more that Ukraine finds itself in a perilous position in NATO's war, the harder and faster NATO's escalations with Russia become. Even in just the last several weeks, we have seen NATO member states in an unhinged manner provoke Russia further, even though the overall Project Ukraine has been an abject failure and is continuing along that path. What do I mean by this? So, we have David Cameron, the so called foreign minister of the United Kingdom, the head foreign officer of the UK Parliament. He has come out and declared that Ukraine has the right not just to use UK arms and weapons that have been shipped to Ukraine over the past several years now since the conflict began in its proxy war against Russia. Ukraine has the right to use these weapons, but Ukraine has the right to use these weapons against Russia on Russia's territory. So there have been dozens upon dozens of attacks on Russian territory committed by Ukraine, famously on the Belgorod region. But now we have, for one of the first times in NATO's history, a open declaration that Ukraine can use these weapons on Russia's territory, which is a major escalation. So here's the Atlantic Council giving the report. UK gives Ukraine green light to use British weapons inside of Russia. So for those of you who don't know, the Atlantic Council is essentially the think tank of the NATO alliance itself. So, but by no means is this some kind of impartial source. So it says Ukraine can use British supplied weapons to strike targets inside of Russia, UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron stated on his May 2nd visit to Kiev. Ukraine has that right, he told Reuters. Just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine, you can quite understand why Ukraine feels the need to make sure it's defending itself, which is very interesting because Russian territory is not in Ukraine. Defense usually means you are defending your own land. So that that in of itself is a contradiction by Mr. Cameron, who, mind you, was he was the one who oversaw the UK's involvement in the destruction of Libya. So the British Foreign Secretary's comments represent a departure from the cautious position adopted by most of Ukraine's Western partners over the past 2 years. Since Russia's full-scale invasion began in February 2022, the majority of countries backing Ukraine have insisted that Western weapons can only be used within Ukraine's international borders and not be deployed against targets inside of the Russian Federation. These restrictions reflect widespread concerns in Western capitals over a possible escalation of the current war into a broader European conflict. Moscow has skillfully exploited the West's fear of escalation, with Kremlin officials regularly warning of Russian red lines and Vladimir Putin frequently making thinly veiled nuclear threats. So far, these intimidation tactics have proved highly effective. So here's what's so ironic is that on the one hand, they try to paint Russia as completely out of control and almost insane, unhinged, right? It's the unhinged one. Mind you, we are talking about the UK saying that weapons from the UK can be used on Russian territory to strike Russia, which essentially makes the UK a party to an overall collective West conflict against Russia. But it's Russia that's the unhinged one. Meanwhile, they say it's effective. It's by threatening to escalate war, Moscow has been able to slow down the flow of military aid to Ukraine while also deterring the delivery of certain weapons categories and limiting Kiev's ability to strike back against otherwise legitimate targets inside Russia. So NATO, of course, the NATO think tank, the Atlantic Council, is saying that there are legitimate targets inside of Russia. And of course, what they mean by this is by portraying this as an invasion, by portraying this as Russia is the one who is offensively going into Ukraine rather than defending itself from NATO encroachment, that Ukraine then should have the right to target especially military installations and other kinds of military related institutions inside of Russia. That would be fair, right? According to NATO. This has placed Ukraine at a significant military disadvantage, already massively outgunned and outnumbered by its larger, wealthier adversary in Russia. Ukraine has had to defend itself without the ability to deploy Western weapons against Russia's military infrastructure. Critics of this approach claim the West is effectively making Ukraine fight against a far larger opponent with one hand tied behind its back. So we don't even have to go further than this, because that's the report. The report is that this is what the UK, this is what Mr. Cameron is saying. This is what he says is reasonable. And essentially what NATO is saying, what the Atlantic Council is saying is, of course you should allow Ukraine to target Russia inside of Russia. That's a great idea. This means that the war will go not only further in terms of its length, it will continue onward. It'll be a permanent conflict, which NATO wants it to be. And of course, the arms manufacturers that control NATO member states want it to be. But also, it not just increases the length of time that this war will continue, it also will create an even bigger conflagration, which we have been saying on this channel for a long time, NATO truly and genuinely wants. It's just a matter of how. So obviously David Cameron, what he's saying is that there is a possibility, there's an opportunity to strike against Russia. Now, in many ways, this is an act of desperation because, as I will show you later, the situation objectively does not really call for such escalations, given the fact that Ukraine is by no means in an advantageous position to begin such hostile offensive operations on a larger scale. But here we go. Here is the second major escalation from a NATO member state. And guess who it is? You see Zelensky there. This is a Newsweek article. While you have Zelensky there on the image, who we are talking about right now is Emmanuel Macron in France. Now, this is the umpteenth time that Emmanuel Macron, just before Xi Jinping arrives to see Emmanuel Macron, and by the time this video is seen by many, that meeting will have taken place. But as it was coming, as the big France-China bilateral meeting was coming, Emmanuel Macron once again opened his mouth and said not only that NATO troops, that France and other NATO members should be more than open to sending their direct military forces into Ukraine to fight Russia, but that there are particular conditions that would make this not just a possibility, but really a necessity. So here are those conditions. It says Ukraine's Western backers in NATO and Europe will have to consider committing troops to the war-torn country under two conditions, said Emmanuel Macron. He told The Economist this in an interview. He said, quote, if the Russians were to break through the front lines, if there were a Ukrainian request, which is not the case today, we would legitimately have to ask ourselves this question. So those are the two conditions. Those aren't really tough conditions. Basically, Emmanuel Macron says it is more than necessary to send NATO troops, to send NATO member state troops to Ukraine if they are requested by Ukraine and if Russia breaks the front line. So two conditions. Russia breaks the front line, which, to be quite frank, as we will see in a bit, that is happening already. Ukraine requesting is really the last domino to fall. If Ukraine were to announce, were to communicate in some way to who? Well, to NATO, to Jens Stoltenberg, perhaps, to Biden, perhaps, because truly Washington is the master of NATO. That would make it a necessity for NATO member states to meet and begin planning and deliberating the deployment of troops. So, Ukraine supporters, although supplying billions in military aid to Kiev, have balked at the idea of sending troops, a move that could draw NATO more directly in conflict with Russia. Macron debuted the potential for NATO troops in Ukraine in late February. As I said, this was his umpteenth time saying this. He said that although there's no consensus or combat personnel back in February, nothing should be excluded when it came to supporting Ukraine. It is not unthinkable, he added, to deploy NATO troops to Ukraine, added Polish Foreign Minister Radoslaw Sikorski. Well, we shouldn't be surprised by that one. Macron's comments shook other NATO leaders, while several of them quickly downplayed the potential of NATO troops on the front lines. For example, Olaf Scholz, German chancellor, said, quote, "There will be no ground troops, no Ukrainian soil, no soldiers on Ukrainian soil there by European countries or NATO states. Boots on the ground is not an option for Germany," said German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius. U.S. President Joe Biden said early on in more than a 2-year-old war that U.S. forces will not be engaged in conflict in Ukraine. And in March 2024, Biden said Kiev was not asking for American soldiers. So it's still not a popular thing. But here is a really interesting comment to add on to what Emmanuel Macron said. So, of course, to both David Cameron's and Emmanuel Macron's comment, Russia was fuming, of course. They said about Emmanuel Macron, the very fact that France is discussing sending certain contingents to Ukraine from NATO countries is a very important new element. And of course, they call it a major escalation. They said the same about what the UK had to say. So Russia, of course, is fuming. Emmanuel Macron, though, added here. He said, "I'm not ruling out anything out because we are facing someone who is not ruling anything out." Of course, Russia being the big boogeyman here. France, he said, quote unquote, "deployed several thousand troops to the Sahel region of Africa to combat terrorism at the request of sovereign states. I think to rule out a priori is not to learn the lessons of the past 2 years." That's what Emmanuel Macron said. Well, what's so interesting about that for Mr. Macron about the Sahel is that France right now is actually on the retreat on the African continent. You had French troops being kicked out of Burkina Faso recently, Niger recently. It has been a rolling catastrophe for French interests, French neo-colonial interests in West Africa in particular. So no doubt this idea that French troops would be a panacea, they can't even maintain against smaller countries that they had politically attempted to control to even a more direct degree than Ukraine. Because let's be honest, Ukraine is a multi-party collective West project led by the United States. But Niger, that's mainly a French project, of course, with US backing. Now, France has been completely kicked out of that region almost entirely. But the big problem here in many estimations and in anyone who has been paying attention is that while these comments are no doubt dangerous coming from the United Kingdom, coming from France, they do represent the potential danger that Russia and NATO are still and remain on a collision course for a disastrous global conflagration that we have not yet seen in history. The fact of the matter is that NATO is in no position to even be making these threats and to insinuate that this would be successful, because Ukraine is being completely routed right now on the battlefield. In order for something like military operations on the soil of your adversary to be successful, well, you're going to have a pretty strong position overall in the war. That is why the attacks on Belgorod and other parts of Russia along the Ukrainian border have been so non-consequential. It's because Russia has been in command in this war for many, many months now, and it's only been getting worse. So here you have Sergei Shoigu. What did he have to say? Well, the top defense chief in Russia said that 100 111,000 Ukrainian troops had been killed or taken out of action in this year alone. How many months has 2024 been now? We're only in the 5th month of 2024. According to Sergei Shoigu, who issued new estimates of military casualties for Ukraine, military losses for Kiev since the beginning of the year surpassed 111,000. Russian forces continue to break up Ukrainian defensive positions along the entire front line, a senior official reported during the ministerial meeting. Russia's territorial gains this year have amounted to 547 square kilometers. He added, so that's not an incredibly huge amount of territory. But let's be honest, any territory gained in a war of attrition just means that you are in a much stronger position in that war. And 111,000 is just such a mind-boggling number given how many months we have experienced so far this year. Shoigu accused the U.S. and its allies of pressuring Kiev into disregarding the cost of continued fighting. As a result, Ukraine suffered 1,000 casualties daily throughout April. Oof. Kiev has ramped up its mobilization efforts due to high attrition, Shoigu added, claiming that Ukrainians are unwilling to fight or being forced to the front line and certain death. The Russian defense chief accused leadership in Kiev of sacrificing citizens for the sake of continued Western financial and military assistance. In April, Shoigu estimated Ukrainian casualties approached 500,000 since the hostilities with Russia started in February 2022. So what does this mean? This means that Ukraine's casualties are much higher than at any point in the conflict, according to at least Russian estimates. But it's not just Russia that is saying this, because oftentimes when we talk about Russian estimates, what do we get? We get a response that we are just being Putin's puppets. We're agents of the Kremlin. We are just spouting propaganda for Russia. Well, the propaganda for Russia has somehow reached the Guardian. Okay. Putin on our doorstep. Ukraine watches as the front line edges closer. Russian forces are advancing in the country's eastern regions, but the recent arrival of U.S. arms could help turn the tide. Mind you, it's not going to help turn the tide, but I'm going to actually fast forward because there's a lot of anecdotal, not so useful, how should I say, commentary here. So here we go. It says, the Kremlin said that Ukraine's eastern provinces are part of quote-unquote historical Russia. In 2014, it swallowed up the two main cities in the Donbas region, Donetsk and Lugansk. In 2022, Russian troops occupied most of Lugansk province. One of the Russian president's key war aims is to reach the administrative borders of the Donetsk Oblast. So the reason why I read that is because this is the meat of what we need to know. That objective seemed impossible in the past, but now, through a string of Ukrainian garrison cities are suddenly in peril as Russian combat units move forward, supported by planes dropping lethal glide bombs. And those glide bombs, mind you, if you listen to people like Brian Berletic of the New Atlas and other military experts, they talk about these glide bombs as being completely out of reach of what few Ukrainian air defenses still exist. So that's a big advantage for Russia's military. Putin's generals are using classic Soviet military tactics from the Second World War, and they're trying to encircle Ukrainian troops on multiple fronts. The capture of Ocheretin means Moscow has tantalizing options. It can push west through Rodivka to the city of Pokrovsk, a key Ukrainian military base, or its forces can head north. If Russia manages to capture the city of Chasiv Yar, it can simultaneously advance from the south, chopping off a further large chunk of Ukrainian territory. For now, Ukraine is hanging on to Chasiv Yar. Months of bombardment have turned its multi-story communist-era blocks into flats into blackened stumps. The Russians have reached the city's eastern outskirts. Fierce fighting continues. But if Chasiv Yar falls, Moscow can use this elevated position to hit a string of nearby military cities. And I'm not even going to try this. Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinivka. They are home to tens of thousands of civilians, as well as to many servicemen. The future of Ukraine's Donbas as a place for normal life seems increasingly bleak. So, mind you, normal life to the Guardian and to the neocons is a life under NATO shelling, a life under Ukraine's shelling, a life of terror, so to speak. But nonetheless, here you see the map, and this is just what the map that the Guardian is using, but you can see Russian forces basically have surrounded are basically at the doorstep of Chasiv Yar. They've moved already far west of Avdiivka, took this small village, I believe, here, and they are moving forward fast to the west. So, in all, this this is a situation that is just not good for Ukraine. And not only is it not good, but it points to the recklessness of NATO attempting to, through its narrative, through its threats, through its verbose leaders, just thumping their chests like Emmanuel Macron. It just shows how reckless these moves are and how it certainly doesn't help Ukraine, and it definitely doesn't help the world, which desperately wants to see this conflict come not just to an end, but to an end that recognizes the legitimate interests of Russia and, of course, the majority of the world, because the majority of the world in the global south, we're not talking about Western, collective West puppet regimes of Washington. We are talking about the rest of the world. The rest of the world sees this conflict as existential as Russia has seen it. So, or as Russia has viewed it. Now, these threats by NATO, we have to really see them as U.S. threats. They're not just threats that are made because the collective West has some kind of independent vendetta. You hear it all the time from Xi Jinping. What does he say? Whenever he talks about Europe and whenever China talks about Europe, they talk about how Europe needs to assert its own strategic autonomy. And why do they say that? Because China, just like Russia, and just like much of the world, sees how Europe has become a vassal of the United States. Now we're going to put on friend of the show, Scott Ritter, was recently on the mother of all talk shows with friend of the show, George Galloway. And this is what he had to say, Scott Ritter had to say about the situation of the collective West. And I think this is an apt analysis because it gets into how the United States as an empire doesn't just control states that are often perceived as weaker in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America, in the so-called global South. It's not just these countries that are being dominated. It's the fact that the United States has dragged Europe along in its imperial policy, and it's just that Europe has not complained one bit. And here is what Scott had to say about this.
After the United States sought to dismantle the British Empire and the French Empire and the Dutch Empire, we replaced it with an American empire. And that's where we are today. We're committing the sins of empire. The British, we flipped the roles. America used to be a colony of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. Today, the British people are, you are a colony of the United States. You can't exist without us. You are nothing without us. You stand for nothing. You've allowed yourself to be so deeply subordinated to us that you are, in fact, one and the same, except you're not, because we don't view you as equals. To us, you're simply a colony that we will use and then dispose of, just like we're disposing of Ukraine, just like we'll dispose of everybody else. But this is about American empire. This is about sustaining American empire. And we treat the British like we treat the French, like we treat the Germans, like we treat everybody in Europe as subordinates who are there to do our bidding. We have basically put the French and the Germans in an untenable situation. They've been locked into bad policy. They have no other options, just like the British have no other options. I mean, they do. They could listen to you, But that's right now, that seems unlikely. The way your government has been created, the political and economic elites that back your government and my government, it's the same. It's all about money, the corruption of money, the corruption of power. We allow the lure of big homes, big cars, big bank accounts to cause us to turn a blind eye to what really matters, which is human beings, the human dignity, and an absolute necessity for us to run to the aid of humans who are suffering, but we're ignoring them. We've stifled their shouts. We've turned a blind eye to the horrific images that are.
So that is what Scott had to say. I mean, I wanted to play that because that is exactly what is going on in Europe. Europe, of course, is not listening to the likes of George Galloway, the UK through David Cameron's comments, France through Emmanuel Macron's comments, are firmly in the grip of the American empire. They are doing its bidding. They are its junior partners. They see a huge benefit to themselves. They see being patrons of the American empire as the best bet for their continued illegitimate rule. Mind you, the vast majority of governments in the collective West are massively unpopular by their own populations. This is how they are attempting to maintain control, by saddling up with the most powerful force, military force and political force in the collective West, and that is the United States. So that is what we are seeing here with France and the UK with their recent escalations. They don't care that Ukraine is in this perilous position. They don't care that Ukrainians are suffering. They don't care that the world is suffering economically from the consequences of this conflict. And they certainly do not care about Russians and Russian people. They are actively promoting and provoking a further escalation of this conflict, which will see not only more dead Ukrainians, but of course, more dead Russians, as they feel and are more than ready and willing to take up the defense of their sovereignty, of Russian sovereignty, against the encroachments of NATO. So that is what is at stake here. What is at stake is a high alert situation, a situation that we have been saying it here on this channel from the very beginning of this conflict, that NATO crossing Russia's red line was going to lead to the unthinkable, which is a direct confrontation between Russia's powerful military force and NATO's, of course, declining military force, but no less nuclear military force. That is what the unthinkable is. That is what is coming if the likes of David Cameron and Emmanuel Macron are not shut up and put in their place, taken out of power, and replaced with a model of governance that reflects the interests of the people, not just of Europe, but of the entire world. That is really what is at stake here. And we're going to have to continue to follow this development so that we are prepared to build that kind of world in the now and in the future. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.